Welcome back, AP Gov students. Today is Unit 1 review. This will be a collection of all the key terms and notes from each chapter of Keeping the Republic that corresponds to Unit 1. As always, if you don't have Keeping the Republic, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I encourage you to follow along and take notes as well. Politics is to cooperate, bargain, and compromise. It defines who gets what, when, and how, meaning it decides how power and resources are distributed among society. The what, when, and how terminology is a big theme throughout this book. What is most commonly just money. A lot of the times it refers to power, but money is definitely the most abundant thing that is distributed by government. When isn't as important because government is always moving. It's always, doing programs and stuff like that. How is the most important for sure. It defines how resources are distributed to people, what systems do that distributing, and how much of it is given out, and things like that. It's all about how resources are distributed by government and how efficient that's done. So I'd say what and how are the two most important things. Power is the ability to influence people. Politicians gain and consolidate power, especially by controlling the media. The effectiveness of politicians and how efficient they're able to get things done and how many things they're able to get done is most reliant on how much power they hold and how much they can influence other people in government and people who vote for them. Government is a system or organization for exercising authority over people. The system that controls how politics are done is critical to how society functions. So the way government is set up is just as important to what government actually does. That's why a huge part of AP Gov, or at least the beginning parts, is how the Constitution is crafted, how the rules of government are set up in a way that makes so politics are done in the most fair way possible. Authority is power that is consented by the people. Legitimacy is what gives governmental institutions the ability to exert power over people. The only way the government is able to control people and make laws and rules that people will follow is if the people consent to actually be under the government's authority. And that principle is explored a lot in American history and Declaration of Independence, the new Constitution, things like that. Rules are directives for how resources are collected. They provide a framework for how things get done without excess conflict or violence. Rules in government and rule following by politicians is important, that things that get passed through government are done fairly and the outcomes in government are just. Norms are implied and understood rules. Unimposed rules are more obvious when they are broken, so norms are often more sensitive. Sometimes rules are meant to be broken, but not norms. Norms, as it applies to government, is just how the behaviors of politicians and what they're supposed to be, how politicians are supposed to go about their lives and their business within government. This can also apply to like a society thing, but that's more like sociology, not really AP Gov. The norms currently in American politics are definitely not what they were before. The norms are starting to collapse a little bit. Politics are getting crazier and crazier nowadays, but in normal American government, normal government as a whole, politicians are all supposed to behave in a certain official way, and that's what the norms are. Narratives, the stories that people believe, they influence how people perceive who has, wants, and deserves resources, and the people's confidence and trust towards those with power. Narratives are a huge thing that are driven by the media, and they are passed on from the media to people and then to more people. The things spread throughout narratives get people believing certain things about how money and power in government is supposed to be distributed, who is supposed to get money and power. This is a callback to that what, when, and how type thing in terms of politics. Economics, production, and distribution of wealth. Resources are inherently economic, so politics and economics are closely related. Pretty much all political things that are passed have to do with some economic side. Certain like criminal laws and stuff like that have nothing to do with economic policy, but almost all spending policy, things that are done in Congress have to do with money. And that's why in terms of like what, money is the most important. So politics and economics is greatly linked. You're going to have a big understanding, not a huge understanding, but you're going to have a pretty decent understanding of economics to get through a lot of the AP Gov stuff. Socialism, leaders make economic decisions based on what everyone needs. The state is in control of the outcome, creating substantive guarantees based on what the state believes people need. There's a lot of nuances with socialism, obviously, because it's always run, in different countries, socialism is done in different ways. But the main principle of socialism is that the state provides guarantees to people to keep them on a certain level, which is a lot different than a capitalist system. If you want to use like sports terminology or something like that, socialism has kind of like a defined floor but a defined ceiling, while a capitalist society has a very low floor and a very high ceiling. There's a lot of more disparity in capitalism, but there's a lot more room for prosperity, and compared to socialism, where there's a lot more equity, but there's not a lot of room for prosperity. Capitalism, economic decisions are decided by the market. Resources are privately owned and are produced and distributed through supply and demand based on procedural guarantees that everyone competes on the same playing field. So substantive versus procedural guarantees, that's kind of a big comparison between the two. Substantive meaning the government provides certain things for people, and procedural guarantees, which means the government sets up a playing field with equal rules but doesn't give people resources. It just allows them to compete for resources. But again, just like socialism, there's a lot of nuances with capitalism. It's not always fair, and there's a lot of problems with not providing guarantees for people, because in a capitalist system, somebody has to win and somebody has to fail. So what do you do with the people that fail? Mixed economies, mix between government control and free market. The government steps in to modify and control capitalism when needed. This is what is seen in the United States and most other developed countries, where you have a capitalist economy that allows people to, produce their own goods, buy their own goods, and prosper in a business sense. But the government provides safety nets, borrowing principles from socialism to prevent people from basically falling into poverty and starvation and just total, abject poverty. No one wants that. So this is where things like social welfare come in to provide that safety net. Because capitalism isn't always perfect, and somebody has to, again, like I said, somebody has to fail. Authoritarian systems give total power to the government over the people. Eliminates the concept of citizenship by making people the subjects of governments existing on both poles of political spectrum. So in far-right authoritarian systems, you have fascism, which is rooted a lot in racism and things like that. And if you go far left, you have communism, which is rooted a lot in classism, where the government controls everyone. Both sides have this logical extreme of authoritarianism. The main principle, however, is that it removes autonomy from the people, and they are no longer citizens of a country, but they are basically just subjects. They're just pawns of the government. Non-authoritarian systems give total power to the individual. Total power might be a little bit of a stretch, but that's the technical definition. Citizens have rights within governments to preserve autonomy, existing usually in the middle of the political spectrum, but can be taken to the logical extreme. The logical extreme would be something like anarchy, where there's just no government. But that's not something that is seen too commonly in any countries, because if you don't have a government, you don't have a country. But in a non-authoritarian system like the United States, citizens have rights within the government that are protected by the government. They have to a certain extent, autonomy over their lives. They're not allowed to do anything. Obviously, we have criminal laws in this country. In a vacuum, there's a lot of extreme views in the United States, but when looking at the total political spectrum, most political views in the United States are very moderate. Although nowadays, the parties are starting to pull a little bit. Democracy, the people create the government. Rooted in the idea of popular sovereignty, allowing the people to fairly establish a government with balanced authority. So in a democracy, the people institute their leaders, they institute their rules and their laws. So elected officials are just one of the functions of democracy, where the people choose how the government works, who represents government. Citizenship, the people have a say in government. Citizens have rights and are protected by the government, but also have obligations in the form of giving back to the government. So the citizens have liberties and autonomy granted by the government for being members of the country, but they also have obligations in a way to sort of pay that back for the rights that are being protected by the government. So certain obligations are like taxes, actually participating in government so the government can function, smaller things like jury duty, things like that, to give back to the government. This is sort of getting into the social contract idea of citizenship, the Enlightenment era. That is explored a lot more in American history, but it'll definitely be explored here in Gov. Classical liberalism, ideology emerging in the Enlightenment, recognizing individual rights. The principles within such ideology are deeply rooted in American and other Western governments. Classical liberalism and the Enlightenment era is a huge reason why most modern Western governments have individual rights, have democracies, because they recognize the importance that the people play in government, that the people, in a sense, are the government. Having a good knowledge of Enlightenment principles is definitely a good way to go through Gov. If you want to explore those principles, there's definitely a lot more in APUSH, but classical liberalism as an umbrella term really defines what American government is and what modern Western governments are. Social contract, agreement between the people and the government. Principle that people give some power to the government in exchange for protection from the government. This goes back to the citizenship type thing, where people give away some of their power so that the government can protect their rights from infringement of other governments, bad people, in exchange for protection from the government. And then because of getting that protection from the government, there is then another layer where they give back in a form of, and because of that protection from the government, they give back in a third layer that allows, or that sort of demands citizens to participate back in government and benefit society. But the main principle of social contract is that people give up some of their autonomy in order to have law and order in society in exchange for protection from the government. Republic, citizen voices are heard through elected representatives. This is what America is. The founders opted for this form of government based on a variety of factors. These factors are explored more in the required documents, like Federalist 10, Federalist 51, Brutus 1, stuff like that. All talks about, how America starts to become a republic. I would say Federalist 10 is the biggest one. Republic, citizen voices are heard through elected representatives. This is what the United States is, a republic. The founders opted for this form of government based on a variety of factors. Take a look at Federalist 10 if you want to find a great essay about why America should be a republic. It is a required document, so you probably read this already or you're going to very soon. Basically, because of the size of the government, you can't have everyone just be a voice in government. So if you set it up in a republic, the people can elect representatives, and that filters the wide variety of voices across the country into a smaller national government that allows the government to remain effective while still being able to hear all people's voices just through representatives. Slavery, system of involuntary servitude, was established in the Americas with a strict racial hierarchy, putting black people at the bottom and white people at the top. Slavery, technically in its origins, was an economic institution, but it had obviously massive effects on society and social life, and then of course American government. When you hear the term systemic racism and structural racism, this dates back to how slavery affected the American government. So the American government responded to slavery as an institution by setting up a system that constantly, in all facets of government, put white people at the top and put black people at the bottom. And this evolved greater and greater in the American government until the civil rights movement started to reverse all that. So slavery in an APUSH sense is a lot more talked about because slavery was a massive, massive era in American history, and a massive, horrible era in American history. But in terms of AP Gov, you want to think about slavery as the origins of racism in American government. Popular sovereignty, the power of the people to govern. The lack of popular sovereignty among the people in the colonies greatly influenced the eventual revolution and split from Great Britain. So because people didn't have representation in Great Britain, the no taxation without representation thing, that inspired a lot of the American independence movement. And popular sovereignty is a big principle in American government because people have the right to participate in government and vote for who they want and talk to their elected representatives and things like that. Common Sense, independence pamphlet written by Thomas Paine, the best-selling book by, I'm pretty sure by population percentage in American history, and it still is. It became one of the most influential pieces of writing of all time and helped to unite colonists under the idea of independence from Great Britain. Common Sense reflected a lot of Enlightenment ideals, which really resonated with American, colonists, I guess you could say. The Declaration of Independence, official document presented by the colonies for independence. It invoked many Enlightenment ideas to justify the colonies becoming independent from Great Britain and listed how the British government had violated the colonies. The Declaration of Independence is a required document in Gov, I'm pretty sure, but it doesn't really matter a whole lot. But just know that the list of grievances are very important, and the ideals in the first part of the Declaration of Independence is really important to how American government was set up by the Constitution. Constitution, document establishing rules that make up how government should run. The US had multiple constitutions. Of course, you had the Articles of Confederation at first, and then the US Constitution. And constitutional debates are at the heart of government, especially in terms of the Supreme Court. Articles of Confederation, the first American Constitution, they contain many flaws, specifically surrounding the lack of central power and the inability for state governments to unite and exert control. So because of the weak government that was set up under the Articles, the US Constitution was crafted, which still stands today. Confederation, system where each state has power over itself. A country is divided into smaller states that have control over itself, and individual rights are handled by states, creating a weak central government. The reason the Articles were set up this way is because they had just come from a monarchy, a big central government in Great Britain. So they set up a confederation where states had a lot more autonomy and there's basically no central government. But this became a problem because you can't really have a unified country without a central government. So that's why the Constitution was eventually crafted. Constitutional Convention, meeting of political thinkers to revise the Articles. Instead of revision, the convention eventually decided to replace the Articles altogether, leading to the creation of a new constitution. The story behind the Constitutional Convention is that it wasn't really supposed to be this radical change. It was just a meeting over why the Articles were failing, but they ended up crafting the US Constitution. Federalism, powers divided between different levels of government. It was at the heart of an important compromise surrounding how the central and state governments should share power. Federalism is probably the most used term in AP Gov, probably the one you're going to have to master the most. You have to be able to separate federalism from separation of powers. It's not about separation of bodies in the government. It's about the separated but shared powers between the national government and state governments. Virginia Plan, large state plan to organize Congress. Favored large states by apportioning representatives based on population size. The larger states obviously like this plan because they would have more delegates in Congress. They'd have more greater representation in Congress because their populations are bigger. New Jersey Plan, small state plan to organize Congress. Favored small states by giving each state an equal amount of representatives. So the small states like this more because they would be on an equal playing field in terms of representation with the massive states. There are some more nuances to the Virginia Plan and New Jersey Plan, but these are probably the most important details. The Great Compromise, combination of both plans to create a bicameral Congress. This is how the House and Senate was made. It created the House and Senate, gave the central government more power under a federalist structure and a single executive. So the House is the Virginia Plan type thing, where you have representatives based on population, and the Senate is the equal body, two representatives for each state. That's the New Jersey Plan part. And it gave the central government more power. It expanded the powers from where it was in the Articles, and it decided on a single executive being the president. There was talks about having this body of presidents, like there would be like 3 or 4 presidents. I'm pretty sure that's what Hamilton proposed or something like that, but they eventually decided on one president, which was a good idea because you have to have a singular head of government to make it effective and to make the government easier to understand. Three-Fifths Compromise defined a slave as 3/5 of a person for population purposes. This is because slave states wanted slaves to count in their population and get more representatives in the House, but small states, not only do they not want to be outmanned by the slave states, but they're also like, if you're the non-slave states, or like if you have slaves, they're not even citizens, how do they count for your population? There's huge ethical problems with all that. It was a compromise between North and South to make sure Southern states couldn't inflate their number of representatives through slave populations. Slaves, of course, they couldn't even vote, so this is always ridiculous for the South. It's one of the many problems during the slavery era. The Federalist Papers, collection of essays advocating for ratification. These papers became some of the greatest essays ever written. They express and explain the purpose and reasoning behind the formation of American government. The Federalist Papers are a huge part of AP Gov. You have to know the required documents. I'm pretty sure it's Federalist 10, Federalist 51, Federalist 70, and Federalist 78. 10 and 51 are definitely most important. You're going to want to know those to heart. Factions, groups of people with a common ideal. This is expressed a lot in Federalist 10, I believe. The dangers of radical factions were a key topic of debate within the Federalist Papers. A lot of it was, how do you have a functioning democracy if you want to have people participate in government? How do you eliminate people who are radical and groups who want to band together to put people in government that will affect only their ideals? And the way to balance out factions was having more people represented in government would allow factions to counter each other out so that they'd have to compromise to get things done. That's a huge part of what Federalist 10 is. Bill of Rights, list of rights protecting people from the government. It was added to the Constitution out of fear that the central government could abuse citizens. So the anti-Federalist people when they kind of decided, okay, fine, we'll implement the Constitution, we'll vote for it, they wanted to have a list of rights to make sure the government couldn't oppress the people, and that's what the Bill of Rights is. Legislative branch, lawmaking body of government. It creates national laws through a bicameral voting system that balances out the influence of the entire will of the people and the will of each state. The legislative branch is Congress, it's the House and the Senate. It's the place that laws are proposed and where laws are passed. Executive branch, law enforcement body of government. It executes the national laws as ordered by the president, as well as its large bureaucratic network. The bureaucracy is a huge part of the executive branch that isn't really known as much because the president is such a figurehead. But the bureaucracy is really important. There's a whole chapter on the bureaucracy that I'm going to go into a lot later. But a huge part of the executive branch is just responding to the legislative branch laws that are passed, and the president and the bureaucracy decide how they're implemented and how the laws are supposed to be achieved, and the goals that are outlined in the laws, how do you approach and eventually get to those goals. Judicial branch, law interpreting body of government. It rules on how and if laws are broken and on the constitutionality of written laws. A huge part of AP Gov is the last part, the Supreme Court cases, how it rules certain things constitutional and unconstitutional. There's a ton of required cases that are going to have to be, mastered basically by you guys. And case law is just a massive part of AP Gov. Judicial review, the power of the court to determine the constitutionality of laws. The power greatly expands the importance of the Supreme Court and allows it to check other branches of government. Judicial review is the main power of the Supreme Court, and it wasn't even one of the original powers of the court. It was created through decisions in cases. But this allows the Supreme Court to strike down laws that are unconstitutional through a case-by-case basis. And this is one of the most influential powers in all of government. Separation of powers, independent branches of government. It prevents the government from becoming too powerful by making the different functions of government entirely separate from one another. So the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch all have different powers, and they don't have a lot of connections to each other. So this allows each branch of government to check each other and make sure one of them isn't becoming too powerful. It's almost like they're competing for influence in government, and this prevents one part of government, or the government as a whole, from becoming all powerful. It's sort of like how factions on the people level they're all in a space where they have to compete with each other. This is how the government is. Checks and balances, ability of the branches of government to watch over each other. It prevents one branch of government from becoming too powerful and allows the government to essentially control itself. Judicial review is a main checking power because they can strike down actions by the legislative and executive branch as unconstitutional. The executive branch has a lot of control over how laws are implemented, so the legislative branch isn't all powerful in lawmaking. But the legislative branch has to make laws. The executive branch can't just make their own laws and enforce their own laws. It's all a check and game between the branches of government, and this prevents any total control. Necessary and proper clause, Congress can do anything if it provides justification. It greatly expands the power of the legislative branch beyond what is specifically written in the Constitution. This was established by a Supreme Court case. Basically, it gives Congress a lot more discretion in what it can make in terms of laws. They don't have to listen strictly to the Constitution. However, the Supreme Court can strike down laws if Congress takes this clause a little bit too far. Supremacy clause, national government trumps state governments. It declares that laws made by the national government overrule those made by lower governments. This expands the power of the national government over the state governments in the federalist structure. The state governments can make a lot of their own laws, but if they come in conflict with national laws, then the national laws take precedent over them. Concurrent powers, powers shared by levels of government. It gives both the state and federal levels authority over specific areas, allowing for cooperation. So in federalism, this is kind of cooperative federalism where both the national and state governments work together on certain issues. McCulloch v. Maryland, case deciding on whether a state can tax a federal bank. It upheld the constitutionality of Congress establishing a national bank and expanded/fortified the necessary and proper clause. So even though the government didn't have explicit power to make a national bank was needed and deemed as necessary to support the economy, so they are allowed to do it. and Maryland as a state couldn't fight back against that because Congress had the authority to make the bank. Gibbons v. Ogden, case deciding on a state's influence on interstate commerce. It ruled to expand the powers of the national government in regards to the Commerce Clause, giving the federal level more power over regulating interstate commerce. This is, I believe, not a required case, but McCulloch v. Maryland is. This basically just said that the national government has power to regulate commerce between states, and states don't have that power because you're going across state borders for economic actions, so it's sort of seen as like a federal thing. So Congress has the ability to regulate interstate commerce. Nullification: a state can reject a federal law it feels is unconstitutional. It gives grounds for states to reject federal laws, although it is not a recognized power by the federal government, which causes it to be the basis of many government conflicts. The nullification crisis really comes to a head around the Civil War because the states, especially the slave states, started rejecting national government actions. Categorical grants: federal money in exchange for direct compliance. It is the more controlling type of federal funding that demands states to do specific things with the money. So the federal government will fund state programs, but the states have to do exactly what the federal government says they need to do with the money. Block grants: federal money in exchange for pursuing a common interest. It is the less controlling type of federal funding that allows states some freedom in deciding how the money is used. So basically the federal government will give money to the states and they say, I want this to be used to better education, or I want this to be used to promote, I don't know, healthcare or something. And the states have more autonomy in over how they use that money to achieve that goal. So some state might pump a lot of money into their elementary schools, and another state might pump a lot of money into their high schools. Things like that. They have more control over how the money is used, and that's what the states want and prefer. Unfunded mandates: federal demands without any funding. It is the least attractive federal mandate from a state's perspective, as they are given no funding to pursue a goal coming from the federal level. So the federal government will tell a state, you have to do this, and they don't even give them any money for it. They just say, you need to take whatever resources you have and achieve this goal. Unfunded mandates kind of disappeared from American politics because there's a lot of compromises that were written, I'm pretty sure in like the 90s, 80s, 90s time, that didn't allow unfunded mandates to be used as often. Initiative, referendum, and recall: ways citizens can influence government. They give alleyways for citizens to affect government on a more direct level, specifically in the legislative branch. It is helpful to know what each term means, but I don't think it's really necessary. You can just drop these 3 words in like an essay or something and use it as an example of how citizens can participate in democracy. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next unit, and goodbye. Yo, if you're super cool and awesome, you should follow my Twitter or X if you're that kind of person. It's @Clark4724. I post a lot of random stuff on there, but I also post channel updates, and when my next videos are coming out. So if you're gonna keep watching my channel, then I recommend you follow, and thanks.